All right, let's go ahead and get started. So welcome back to Macroeconomics. Look, we got the 23rd. And we're going to pick up from where we left off when we were talking about economic growth and talking about that fallacy that there's limits to growth. So this fallacy that there is limits to growth, right? So essentially, there were these computer models that were made, right? And, they said that, the depletion of the natural resources combined with the environmental damage, essentially unregulated, right? Environmental damage. That that this means that growth is not sustainable. So why were they wrong? So a few reasons, right? They didn't take into account, new and better quality products. Some of the higher income increases in the income can be used to better environmental quality, right? Can be used to better environmental quality. And then lastly, the most important thing when it comes to, what we're talking about in economics, right, is it ignored the market's response to scarcity. So what do we mean by that, right? So high prices of something they're going to trigger a response. So, what happens, so that the example the book uses, which is a great example, is, the strong response to the energy crisis in the mid 70s. Right? What did they do? They rationed gasoline. That was the short-term kind of thing, right? And then what happens in the long term? So what happened when the price of gasoline spiked in 2008, or that kind of era, right? So mid 2000s, everyone was driving SUVs because the price of gas was so low. And then when that price of gas shot up, as it did temporarily, right? When the price of oil, gas, I think it reached its peak in 2000. We can take a look at it in a second. When the price of oil and gas shot up, what did people do? The short-term effect, they limited their trips, right? Limited any kind of, voluntary trips. And then also, they ditched their Hummers and stuff, and they got more fuel efficient cars, right? So they bought more fuel efficient vehicles. Now, when it's something that is, so large, like, when we're talking about global, environmental kind of stuff, right? Environmental externalities. These do, this does have the potential to, severely limit our growth. So, domestic ones, right? We think that the price adjusts to that scarcity, right? But when it's a global, neither the individual nor the governments really have enough power. There's also a problem of, there's a collective action problem in terms of you have to get everyone to sign onto these things, and there's little enforcement. Like part of the, there's like a joke, like what's the biggest joke of international law? Like international law, like who enforces it, right? And so you have to get all of these people to essentially, kind of handcuff themselves, so to speak, environmentally, right? And all it takes is one country or two countries doing what's called this race to the bottom in terms of either labor standards or environmental quality to essentially renege on that agreement. And then they end up doing what? They end up polluting the atmosphere. It's not a local pollutant, right? It's everybody is affected by it. And so then other people are going to be like, well, screw this. Why are we like tying our hands when, Indonesia or Malaysia or whatever, right? They're not doing what they said that they were going to do, right? So, like, yeah, that's kind of enough of that. All right, let's move on to chapter 8. Chapter 8, talk about labor market. We've already talked a bit about this, so we're going to go fairly fast through chapter 8 here. Because, we already understand a lot of what's going on in terms of the unemployment, right? But there's also, some different trends that we have here in terms of, like the real earnings of the United States, right? So we have trend number 1. The real earnings, right? So this is adjusted for inflation. The real earnings are twice in 2016, because the book's a little old, right? Were twice the real earnings in 1960. So not bad, 56 years, we've doubled the real earnings. And if we look at 1929, right, that peak right before that Great Depression, if we look at, the peak of the Roaring 20s, right, the U.S. earnings, real earnings, what were they? They were 5 times the real earnings in that peak of the Roaring 20s in 1929, right before everything went to shit. So, industrialized countries, or actually, sorry, because this is all part of trend 1, apologies. These are just facts. What's the actual trend, right? It's that industrialized countries which, of which we are one, have enjoyed real wage growth over the 20th century? That's kind of our, forest picture, right? Kind of zooming out and taking a look at what happened in the last 100 years, especially when you compare that to what happened in the 100 years before that, right? The standard of living keeps getting, it keeps doubling quicker all the time. And part of that is because of the increases in technology and kind of how that increases the efficiency of not just our work, but also just our daily life, right? Communications and so on and so forth. What's our second trend? Our second trend is that the rate of the real wage growth, the rate of growth, so the rate of real wage growth, how fast it's increasing, right? That has stagnated. What do we mean by stagnated, right? Stagnation is like a swamp, right? It's not moving, it's staying the same, you're stuck. Stagnation, right? Stagnated since 1973. So part of this, right? So we always ask, well, why is this? And we're going to learn, we're going to model this during this class, right? So the reason why is a couple of reasons, but one of the main reasons is there was a big increase in the number of people that were with jobs. The percent of people, the percent of the population employed substantially increased, right? That labor force, the percent of the population that's employed substantially increased during this time. And so if we look at just the data, which of course we want to do, right? Data is awesome. We look 1960 to 1973, there was wage growth of 2.5% per year. That's pretty darn good, right? What if we go from, that's good. Is that fine? Turn the lights off. It's actually better. Okay, I could figure out how to do that. That'd be great. 1973 to 1995, that had 0.9% growth per year. That's like nothing, right? It's no bueno. From 1996 to 2007, right? This is the advent of the computer kind of hitting the office and internet and the dot-com era and household wealth increasing because housing values increased like crazy during the beginning of the 2000s, right? And so people are spending money and more businesses are getting made, right? And so we have a 1.8% increase per year during this period. During that Great Recession that we just got out of, right? That was a bit worse than this period of what we call, this is a period of what we call wage suppression. Because it didn't coincide with any sort of recession. It had to do with an influx of laborers, an increase in outsourcing, a decrease in labor power because of policies that were taken into effect by Reagan and Thatcher during that decade, right? 0.7% per year, which benefited businesses, right? But came at the cost of the workers, right? So if we look at the full kind of if we take all three of these together, right, and we look at 1970 to 2012, and we average that all out, we only get 1.1% per year in terms of real wage growth. And so what did we learn last class? the rule of 72, right? It takes, it's 72 divided by the compounding interest rate to tell you how long it's going to take things to double. So if our real wage growth is only 1, that means it's going to take 72 years for the wage rate to double, rather than the 50 years that we saw before, right, in the empirical data. So this leads us to our third trend, which is that there has been increased wage inequality in the US. So, increased wage equality in the US. Between 1970 and 2016, average real weekly earnings of worker at the low end decreased. Average weekly real earnings of low end of just the low end of the distribution. The blue collar workers, if you will, that decreased. While during the same time, the real wages, and it decreased by 25 to 30%. So not a small amount that it decreased by. Whereas the best educated, highest skilled workers their real wage increased during the same period. So, you guys probably know this, but it's worth noting here, right? That the income with an advanced college degree is going to be 3 times the income of a high school graduate. And 4 times a worker who didn't finish high school. They got their GED or just didn't finish. That's why we're here, right? At the end of the day, we're both trying to better ourselves, but we're also trying to make ourselves more productive, more effective workers or managers so that we can get a greater income and enjoy a better quality of life. What's our fourth trend, Chris? Well, glad you asked. Fourth trend is, and we talked about this a little bit, right? The number of people with jobs, number of employed, has increased in the past 50 years. Recently, because of the recession and stuff, and obviously because of the coronavirus, right? The rate of job growth has slowed. So to kind of give us some snapshots here, right? In 1970, 57% of people about over the age of 16 had jobs. And by 2000, this number had increased to 64%. But then if you go to 2017, it went down to 60%. So the number of jobs during this period grew by 36%, and the number of people, that were over the age of 16, that were and less than 65, right, that aren't retired, grew by only 25%. So if we wanted to, and so let's quickly find it first, give you guys as a hand rest. Here's our civilian labor force participation rates. So we can see, so what are these shaded regions here? Recessions. So the shaded regions are recessions for us. And we see, during this little dot-com bust, right? We had a jump from, this peak of 67 down to, ended up, it got down to 66.5 at one point, and then it was at 66.5 again, and so we've had this kind of downward trend to it, right? Took another hit during the crisis. This is a lagging indicator, though. It takes time for it to really hit. And then this was the very stagnant recovery, right, where labor force participation hovered around the low 60s, and it was 63, and then boom, we went all the way down to 60%. Recent report came out that says that the worldwide labor force in terms of income decreased by 10% because of coronavirus. So it's a lot. What does that mean? That means that there's 10% less demand out there, right? That's why a lot of people, there's a recent poll that came out that says a lot of people, support more stimulus, because, there's a lot of people that are unemployed. There's a lot of people that, the restaurants or whatever, they're restricted in terms of the number of hours. It's very difficult for people to be turning a profit right now, right? A lot of people are operating under losses. All right, so back to fun stuff. Stop share. Sweet. All right. So our last trend is, and you guys probably have heard this, right? But we're going to talk about why it is. Western Europe, particularly France, but also Germany, they have suffered higher unemployment than the US. So why is that? Well, first of all, let's back it up with some facts, right? So unemployment in France, in the period of 1990 to 2001, before that dot-com bust, was 10.9%. The same period, the US unemployment was 5.5%, which again is kind of normal, right? We kind of expect there to be a certain amount of unemployment around, and we're going to get to why that is in a second. And then this has continued through the recession, right? The French unemployment in 2017 was 9.8%. And in the U.S., right, we were doing good in terms of our recovery until we got hit by coronavirus and everything. We had a unemployment rate in 2017 of 4.4%, right? That was pretty damn good. So there's similar problems in a lot of other Western European countries as France, right? The reason for this is there's a lot of protection for the workers, right? So there's lots of worker protection laws. And so what does that mean? That means it makes it difficult to fire somebody. And when it's difficult to fire somebody, what does that mean? That means you're going to think twice, maybe even 3 times, right? About hiring anybody new. It's like a marriage. Not as easy to get out of in the U.S., right? Most of the U.S., you could just fire somebody. You don't have to give a reason. Like in Florida and stuff, like it's a no fault. You can just say like you're fired. You don't have to have a reason. These places, if you do that, you get in trouble. The person can sue, and then they have to keep them employed, which I'm sure does not make for a very productive operation, right? So, just like with everything else, right, we can use supply and demand to analyze the labor market, right? So, we've got a real wage on the y-axis. We've got a number of people employed on the x-axis, right? And so what ends up happening? Well, there's the law of demand going on here, right? In terms of as the wage increases, I'm likely to, so as the labor demand, relatively much. Okay. So this is backwards. So when we're talking about labor demand, right? So we're used to thinking about labor demand. We're used to thinking about demand from the consumer's perspective, right? When we're talking about labor demand, we have to think about this from the employer's perspective. Right? And so essentially, the employers, those are the people that are actually demanding the laborers, right? The labor hours. And so if these labor hours become more expensive, the price of them goes up, then what are they going to do? They're going to switch to more capital goods, and they're going to use less labor. How do they use less labor? They're going to switch to more capital in their production mix. And we've seen some of this, where, Panera has self-ordering, you order with a machine now, and then they bring it to your table. Or we've seen this with the self-checkouts in Walmart, right? We've seen, so essentially, they'll invest the $1 million or whatever it is in each one of those self-checkout machines because it's going to make more sense than hiring more people to run more lines, right? But, and so part of that is, there might have been a movement in terms of the real wage, right? If the real wage increases, so let's say that, there's an increase in the minimum wage, it goes from $6.50 to, let's say $9 or something, right? Well, what are the businesses going to do? They're gonna fire people, right? And they're gonna just, build some robots to replace the people, right? And so that would go from, I don't know, what's the I bet it's like 132 million or something like that to like 120 million people that were employed. And that's one of the arguments about increasing the minimum wage, right? Is that it's going to cause higher unemployment. We are used to thinking about the supply of labor, right? We're out there, we're selling ourselves, we're selling our labor hours. And so the supply of labor is actually going to make more sense to us in terms of when that real wage increases, I'm going to be more likely to enter the labor force, or I'm going to be more likely to kind of work overtime or get an extra job or something like that, right? So this is our labor supply curve. And you know, at a certain point, it goes vertical, because at a certain point, there's just only so many people. This is the population of the country, right? You can't work more than that. I guess you could get migrant workers and stuff like that, but then they would still count as like the potential population. So it approaches some limit, and the trade-off gets larger and larger. So just like anything else, if we put these two together, we're going to get what? An equilibrium. It's going to tell us, you know, either the average wage rate for the whole of an economy, usually more the average wage rate for like a particular industry, right? So this is going to be the equilibrium wage rate. So we would say, you know, the W star. And why do I say the W star, right? So before we were kind of in micro land, right? Microeconomics land. So we were talking about, you know, profit optimization, right? And so it was choosing the optimal amount of quantity that would make that profit square the biggest. Now we're back to balancing the supply and demand, right? And we're saying that at this wage rate, there's going to be a number of laborers supplied, or sorry, laborers demanded, you know, by the different firms, right? That's going to exactly equal the number of, you know, labor hours, the number of people that want to be employed at that wage rate, right? The number of people employed. Because as we all know, you can jump in and out of the labor force, right? No, you don't have to say anything. Now, are you guys in the labor force right now? No, because you're full-time students. So technically not in the labor force. What it causes the labor demand to increase, right? What causes employers to want more humans? What's the cause of this? Well, if we have any sort of increase in productivity, you know, of the average worker, then, you know, they're going to get more out of each worker, right? And so that means for any given wage, they're going to want more workers, or they're going to want their workers to work more hours. Other increases, it's got a nice little. And then the other one is an increase in that price, right? So if all of a sudden it became, increase in the price of whatever good and service the firm is producing. All right. Let's talk about our 3 types of unemployment, and then we can move on to chapter 9. Three types of unemployment are frictional, and so this occurs when workers are between jobs. We think of this as having a short duration and a low economic cost. And actually, a little bit of frictional unemployment may actually increase economic efficiency, right? So some may increase economic efficiency. The fact that there's always somebody there, that kind of, is looking for your job or something, right? Or the fact that you're looking to, get a better job, to show how productive you are, or what a great employee you are, or whatever, how much sales you made, right? So, the existence of what Marx would call the reserve army of labor. So this isn't in your book, but Marx talked about this way back in the day, the reserve army of labor. The existence of that, is really a nice disciplining tool to the existing labor force in terms of, squashing down union power, labor power, etc. What's our second type? Our second type is going to be cyclical unemployment. Right, so this is unemployment that happens because of economic downturns, recessions. So these we think of, they're usually pretty short duration. Usually, if it's handled right. So I say if it's handled right, right? So what happened in 2008? Number one, like what happened in terms of the mortgage-backed securities and so on and so forth. I'll find some like short little video, and we'll take a break on Friday's class, and we'll talk about that. But essentially, what happened in the recovery period was the Federal Reserve did everything it was supposed to do. The Congress and the executive branch did everything that they were supposed to do, and the banks just sat on a big pile of money, and they didn't lend. And partly because they were worried about their balance sheets, and so they were worried about the fact that they had a bunch of debt that they owned that was toxic or that could have been toxic, and so they wanted to wait for that debt to fall off their balance sheet, right, for them to get paid back that money before they made any more loans. But it was really one of those situations where the greatest fear is fear itself, right? And so the fear of the banks to lend and stimulate was really what created such a long, slow recovery. That's at least the consensus opinion at this moment. Last type of unemployment. Oh, why did I say 3? I meant 2. Oop. My brain's working. Last type of unemployment that we have is going to be structural unemployment. So I think we are going to see a lot of this in our lifetime. Way more than our parents saw. So structural unemployment, this is long-term chronic unemployment in a well-functioning economy. So it's not due to any sort of recession. And so, there's a lot of this in Greece right now because, they don't know the language, right? So it could be the lack of language. There's a lot of refugees from Northern Africa and Greece, they don't know the language, they're not getting trained at all, right? And so they end up stealing. There's a lack of skills. Or it could just be, simple discrimination. The gypsies in France, right? Doesn't matter how skilled they are, most French people are not going to hire them. There's also some barriers to unemployment. I mean, this is actually really, it says barriers to unemployment, but I'm going to say contributors. That's actually more accurate. Contributors to unemployment. They're kind of barriers to employment. Oh, that's what it says. Sorry. Contributors to unemployment / barriers to employment. So what are some of these, right? Well, that minimum wage that we talked about. Without that minimum wage, there would be more people working, right? But they would be making less. The existence of unemployment insurance. Unemployment insurance. So, if you hire somebody and then you have to lay them off, your unemployment insurance goes up. So it's going to cost you more money in the future for that unemployment insurance, and you have to have that unemployment insurance. It's a requirement. You're paying, we both pay into it. And then lastly is the unions, right? The existence of unions, which is, consolidation of labor power. Unions, fight for, more benefits, shorter hours, more humane or safe conditions, right? And all of those things, what are those? Those are costs. And so that means that it's going to make production overall more expensive. And so what's that going to do? The existence of a union, just like we said, any sort of technological change or something that makes it cheaper to produce is going to shift it to the right. That means that this labor demand is going to shift to the left as a result of whatever those union demands are. If they're met. Talk a bit more about it, but we've got to move on. Chapter 10. We'll spend a little bit of time on this today, and then we'll finish this up on Friday, because this is the last chapter you guys are going to be tested on your second midterm, which opens up tomorrow and is due Monday night. Chapter 10 talks all about money, prices, and that weird thing that a lot of people hate and other people don't understand it, the Federal Reserve. What is that thing? We're going to learn all about it. I know you're going to get your seat. Let's go ahead and just define money, and then we're going to go ahead and call it a day. All right, so what in the heck is this money? Money is any asset that can be used in the making of purchases. So, what are some examples of money, right? Well, we've got coins, currency, your checking account balance, your debit card, right? Any sort of digital currency, right? Cryptocurrency. And money, we think, has three principal uses. What are those three principal uses? I'm glad you asked. Well, the first one we already talked about, right? It's that medium of exchange. I can use it to buy stuff, right? So we're avoiding that double coincidence of wants, right? That hungry tailor meeting the freezing baker, right? So the tailor's like, I'll get you some clothes. And the baker's like, I'll get you some bread. Everybody's happy. But that's a double coincidence of wants, right? Doesn't always happen. Second, it's a unit of account. So, we price things in it. Kind of goes hand in hand with one, if you ask me, but they separate it. And then lastly, and this is the one where people will argue that maybe cryptocurrency is not quite money because it has to be a store of value. And so money, I talked about that already, right? What does money do? It makes barter unnecessary. Right? That double coincidence of wants. We're the hungry Taylor. Oh, not like that. Not like the name Taylor, Chris. Taylor. Hungry Taylor meets the freezing baker. So no need to trade goods directly. All right, I'll see you guys on Friday. If you can't make it, go ahead and just watch the YouTube. I'll send a Zoom link out as well if you want to watch it live. Best of luck studying. Send me emails with any questions, comments you might have. Thanks.